Welcome to Sleepy Crime, where the night is long, the rain is steady, and the darkest stories unfold in whispers. Tonight, we leave behind the lone figure of the wandering killer, and step instead into a story of two men who found each other in prison and together became something far more terrifying. California in the late 1970s was a place of beaches, freedom, and hitchhiking youth. But rolling quietly through those sunlit streets was a white van, a van that would come to be known as a chamber of horrors. Inside were not only two predators, but a collection of ordinary tools, pliers, hammers, screwdrivers, twisted into instruments of torture. For 5 months in 1979, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris prowled the highways, hunting young girls. What happened inside that van remains one of the most disturbing chapters in true crime history. So settle in, let the rain fall softly, and join us as we begin the chilling story of the Toolbox Killers, evil in a van. When trying to understand how two men could come together and create one of the most sadistic partnerships in American criminal history, it is necessary to step back to the beginning, to the years of formation. The shadows of childhood that shaped Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. These were not ordinary boys who simply went astray. Their paths were marked early by rejection, instability, abuse, and choices that consistently pulled them away from empathy and toward cruelty. The story of the Toolbox Killers is not just about what they did together in 1979. It is also about the broken pieces of their early lives that clicked together like jagged gears when they finally met. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on September 27, 1940. From the very beginning, his life was defined by absence. His biological parents did not want him, and he was placed for adoption almost immediately. For many children, adoption can mean stability and love. But for Lawrence, it became the first wound. He grew up never knowing his real parents, and carried that sense of abandonment with him like a scar. His adoptive family moved frequently due to his father's work in the aviation industry, preventing him from putting down roots or forming lasting friendships. This constant shifting from one city to another left Lawrence isolated, a child without a stable home base. A young boy learning early that attachments did not last. As a student, Bittaker displayed a high intelligence. His IQ would later be measured at 138, while above average. Teachers recognized his ability, but intelligence did not translate into discipline or empathy. Lawrence was withdrawn, often cold, and seemed detached from the other children. He was not a boy who thrived on connection. He was a boy who built walls. His first arrests came while he was still a teenager. Shoplifting, car theft, and other petty crimes became his way of testing boundaries, of asserting control in a world where he had grown up feeling powerless. The police grew to know his name, and soon juvenile facilities became as familiar to him as classrooms. By the time Bittaker reached adulthood, he was no longer just a troubled young man, he was a hardened offender. He dropped out of high school and traveled west to California, where his crimes escalated. His early arrests in the 1950s and 1960s included theft, hit-and-run incidents, and parole violations. Each conviction added to his criminal record, yet he showed no remorse. What defined Bittaker was not fiery violence, but cold calculation. He was not impulsive. He was detached, rationalizing his behavior as though the world owed him something. Behind that quiet exterior was a man who had no real regard for the rules that bound others. Prison became a revolving door for him, and he entered it with the same indifference with which he committed his crimes. For Bittaker, incarceration was not a shame but simply part of his rhythm of life. If Bittaker's childhood was marked by abandonment and emotional coldness, Roy Norris's early years were steeped in instability and abuse. Roy was born on February 5, 1948, in Greeley, Colorado. into a deeply dysfunctional household. His parents were poor, and his father's work forced the family to move frequently, echoing the instability that Bittaker had also known. But for Norris, the pain ran deeper. His family environment was abusive, filled with neglect and hostility. His mother was addicted to drugs, and his father struggled with alcoholism. Together, they created a home that offered no safety, no stability, and no nurturing for a developing child. Placed for periods of time with foster families, Norris never developed a strong sense of belonging. The households he was sent to were often cold or outright abusive, reinforcing his feelings of rejection and worthlessness. By the time he reached adolescence, he had already experienced sexual abuse at the hands of older relatives and foster figures. These traumas would echo throughout his adult life, distorting his understanding of relationships, intimacy, and power. Unlike Bittaker, who was detached and calculating, Norris was impulsive, volatile, and emotionally unstable. He developed a deep sense of resentment, a conviction that the world had treated him unfairly. As a teenager, Norris began experimenting with drugs and alcohol, substances that dulled his pain but also amplified his instability. He had difficulty in school, often clashing with teachers and authority figures. His anger found expression in acts of rebellion and early criminal behavior. He stole, vandalized, and ran away repeatedly. But beneath the surface, more disturbing patterns were emerging. Norris developed violent sexual fantasies, shaped by his early abuse and his growing resentment toward women. These fantasies were not fleeting thoughts but compulsions that would later drive his crimes. By his late teens, Norris dropped out of high school and drifted aimlessly. He enlisted in the Navy and served a tour in Vietnam, but the military did not instill discipline or direction in him. Instead, the war amplified his psychological fractures. He saw violence firsthand, and though his service record was not particularly distinguished, the experience hardened him. He returned to the United States more alienated than before, carrying trauma that would mix with his existing rage and resentment. While Bittaker was serving repeated stints in California prisons, honing his manipulative skills and learning to mask his true nature, Norris was slipping into darker crimes. His arrests in the 1960s and 1970s included rape and assault. He demonstrated a willingness to use force to get what he wanted, and his victims often included women he barely knew, chosen at random. These crimes revealed the difference between him and Bittaker. Where Bittaker was methodical, Norris was reckless. Where Bittaker was calculating, Norris was impulsive. It is striking to consider how their childhoods, though different, led them along parallel tracks toward destruction. Bittaker's abandonment bred coldness and detachment. Norris's abuse bred rage and volatility. Both men grew up without stable foundations, without families to anchor them, without positive role models to guide them. Both were raised in environments that normalized instability and pain. By the time they reached their 30s, they were predators circling the same prison system, ready to find in each other the missing half of a partnership that would unleash terror. The phrase childhood shadows is not an exaggeration when describing these men. In many serial offenders, criminologists look back to the formative years and find warning signs: cruelty to animals, early thefts, obsession with fire, fantasies of domination. Both Bittaker and Norris displayed variations of these traits. They were not boys who stumbled once and found themselves off course. They were boys who consistently chose darker paths, who rehearsed their rebellion against society in small acts of cruelty long before they escalated to murder. By the 1970s, Bittaker was in his late 30s, drifting in and out of prison on charges ranging from theft to assault. Norris, younger by 8 years, was already serving time for violent sexual crimes. Their paths had not yet crossed, but the prison system was a revolving stage. bringing men like them together in cycles. When they finally met inside the California men's colony in San Luis Obispo in 1977, it was not a chance meeting between strangers. It was the intersection of two lifetimes of damage, two sets of scars and shadows converging in one place. The details of their childhoods matter not as excuses, but as pieces of a puzzle. They reveal how rejection, abuse, and neglect can ferment into hatred, how intelligence without empathy can become manipulation, and how trauma without healing can evolve into rage. Together, those elements created the foundation for a partnership that would horrify the world. Alone, each man was dangerous. Together, they would become infamous. In looking at their early lives, one can see the seeds of what was to come: Bittaker's cold planning and indifference, Norris's volatility and hunger for domination. Each man lacked the capacity for remorse, though in different ways. For Bittaker, it was intellectual, a belief that remorse was unnecessary, that he was above the rules. For Norris, it was emotional, a storm of impulses and resentments that drowned out empathy. In prison, these complementary flaws would draw them together like magnets. The boys who grew up in unstable homes, who carried rejection like a brand, who learned violence instead of compassion, became men whose darkest fantasies would find expression in a white van on the highways of California. Their childhood shadows stretched long into adulthood, and when they finally overlapped, those shadows became one of the darkest nightmares California would ever know. When we leave behind the early shadows of childhood, what comes next often tells us whether the scars of the past will harden into resilience or fester into rot. For Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the years that followed adolescence did not heal. Instead, they carved deeper wounds, shaping to men who learned to move through life not with trust or empathy, but with manipulation, cruelty, and violence. By the time the two eventually crossed paths in prison during the late 1970s, each had already built a record of destruction that foreshadowed the horrors they would one day commit together. Their stories ran on separate but eerily parallel tracks, spiraling downward through crime, incarceration, and a growing intimacy with violence. For Lawrence Bittaker, adulthood was simply an extension of his teenage delinquency. He had grown up unwanted, emotionally detached, and bitter, and he carried those traits into every decision he made. After drifting westward from Pennsylvania, he planted himself in California. But this was no pursuit of new beginnings. California, with its sprawling cities and endless highways, was fertile ground for someone like Bittaker, intelligent enough to navigate the system, but too cold and self-absorbed to live within it. His early arrests stacked up quickly. Card thefts, shoplifting, parole violations. Each crime was small in isolation, but together they revealed a pattern, a man incapable of living without taking. What stood out about Bittaker was his lack of remorse. Judges, parole officers, and prison psychologists often remarked that he spoke about his crimes with a chilling detachment. He did not rage, did not plead, did not even defend himself with passion. Instead, he explained, rationalized, and minimized. In his mind, rules applied to others, but not to him. When he was caught, it was not because of guilt or failure, it was because society had interfered. He saw himself as smarter than those around him, and in many ways, he was. With an IQ of 138, he could have been successful in countless pursuits. But brilliance without conscience becomes something far more dangerous. By the mid-1960s, Bittaker's crimes grew more reckless. He was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon after stabbing a store clerk who confronted him for shoplifting. Though the victim survived, the act revealed that Bittaker's violence could erupt when cornered. He spent years in prison for the offense, where he continued to hone his ability to mask his nature. Other inmates described him as quiet, self-contained, and manipulative, someone who could read people and exploit their weaknesses. Yet behind that controlled exterior was a growing interest in domination, especially over women. Though less overt than his future partner Norris, Bittaker's prison files hinted at a man whose fantasies were darkening, whose need for control was metastasizing into something more sinister. When he was paroled, he did not transform. He cycled through low-wage jobs and temporary housing, never holding onto either for long. He drove aimlessly, prowled neighborhoods, and sought out fleeting thrills. Arrests for theft and parole violations kept him tethered to the justice system. The revolving door of prison and parole became a rhythm of his adult life, one he accepted as natural. Yet no matter how many times he was caught, no punishment softened him. If anything, each arrest seemed to make him colder, more convinced that he was untouchable in the long run. For Lawrence Bittaker, life was not about connection or contribution. It was about power, about seeing what he could get away with, and about rehearsing the control he would one day exercise in its most horrific form. While Bittaker perfected his detachment, Roy Norris was walking a different but equally destructive road. If Bittaker was the cold architect of cruelty, Norris was the storm, impulsive, volatile, and driven by compulsions he neither controlled nor resisted. His upbringing, marked by neglect and abuse, had left him emotionally fractured. By the time he reached adulthood, his fantasies of violence against women had already taken hold, and his crimes reflected those dark urges. Norris's first serious offenses emerged in the late 1960s, not long after his service in the Navy. While stationed, he had been disciplined for inappropriate behavior and unauthorized absences, a sign of his inability to adapt even within the structured military environment. When he returned to civilian life, his impulses only grew worse. He attacked young women in public places, attempting to assault them. In 1969, he was arrested for attempted rape after following a woman into her car and trying to force himself on her. He was sentenced to probation, a punishment that underestimated the severity of his danger. The following years showed a clear escalation. Norris did not simply reoffend, he became bolder. He stalked women, harassed them, and carried out sexual assaults. His victims ranged from strangers he encountered on the street to acquaintances he lured into vulnerable positions. Arrest reports describe his attacks as sudden and violent, often leaving his victims traumatized but alive. Unlike Bittaker, who preferred to manipulate and plan, Norris's violence was impulsive. It erupted in moments of rage or lust, with little regard for consequence. This recklessness ensured that he was caught repeatedly, but also highlighted just how compulsive his behavior had become. By 1970, Norris had been sentenced to time in prison for multiple sexual assaults. His file began to grow thick with psychiatric evaluations. Some psychologists noted his deep resentment toward women, tied to his early abuse and his fractured sense of self. Others saw him as a sociopath, incapable of true empathy. Whatever the label, the conclusion was the same. Roy Norris was dangerous, and his behavior showed no signs of stopping. Yet, like Bittaker, he slipped through the cracks of a system more focused on temporary punishment than lasting intervention. He served time, was released, and offended again. One of his most disturbing early crimes occurred in 1975, when Norris picked up a female student walking home alone. He offered her a ride, but instead drove to a secluded area where he attempted to assault her. When she resisted, he threatened her life. Though she managed to escape, the attack was a clear indication of the kind of violence he was willing to inflict. He was arrested soon after and sentenced to prison, where he would remain through much of the late 1970s. In these years, the paths of Bittaker and Norris were moving closer. Both were in California. Both were serving time in prison for serious offenses, and both were deeply entrenched in cycles of violence that the system seemed unable to break. Yet their personalities remained distinct. Bittaker, older by nearly a decade, was the methodical planner, someone who approached crime as an experiment in power. Norris, younger and more erratic, was the impulsive aggressor, someone whose rage bubbled too close to the surface. It would take only the right conditions, and the isolation of prison walls, for these two damaged lives to intersect. Looking back on their separate histories, criminologists often note how the two men represented complementary halves of a deadly whole. On his own, Bittaker might have remained a lifelong criminal, drifting in and out of prison for theft and occasional violence. He lacked the impulsive drive to escalate consistently. On his own, Norris might have continued his pattern of assaults and rapes, dangerous but disorganized, prone to mistakes that ensured his arrests. But together, they would balance each other's weaknesses and magnify each other's strengths. Bittaker's cold planning would shape Norris's impulses into a method. Norris's hunger for violence would push Bittaker's detached fantasies into action. The roads they walked before meeting were littered with victims, missed opportunities for intervention, and warning signs ignored or underestimated. Both men should have been recognized as threats far earlier. Their records were extensive, their behaviors escalating, and their disregard for law absolute. Yet in the chaos of the 1960s and 70s justice system, they were repeatedly paroled, released, or overlooked. Each release became another chance for their compulsions to grow unchecked. Each sentence served was not a period of rehabilitation, but a rehearsal for what came next. By 1977, both men found themselves incarcerated at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, a facility notorious for housing a wide range of offenders. It was here, behind the prison walls, that their paths finally crossed. What began as a casual acquaintance between two inmates hardened buyers of crime would evolve into something far darker. They began to talk, to share fantasies, to compare experiences. In Bittaker, Norris found someone who could give form to his violent urges. In Norris, Bittaker found someone reckless enough to act on his darkest ideas. The bond formed quickly, fueled by shared fantasies of abduction, torture, and murder. In the years leading up to that meeting, the paths of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were separate, but parallel rivers of violence, winding through broken childhoods, reckless crimes, and repeated incarcerations. Each man brought his own brand of cruelty, one cold and calculating, the other impulsive and raging. Their convergence was not inevitable, but once it happened, it was unstoppable. What had been dangerous on their own would become catastrophic together. By the mid-1970s, both Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris had already carved out their own separate reputations within the California prison system. They were not notorious criminals whose names made headlines. They were not masterminds in the style of organized crime. Instead, they were part of the endless tide of repeat offenders, men who drifted in and out of correctional facilities, their records thick with theft, assault, and in Norris's case, sexual violence. The prison system in California during this era was bursting at the seams, with rehabilitation programs struggling to keep up, and parole boards often overwhelmed by sheer numbers. In that crowded landscape, Bittaker and Norris found themselves confined at the same time within the walls of the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. It was here in the late 1970s that two broken lives intersected, and from that intersection, one of the most horrifying partnerships in American criminal history would be born. The California Men's Colony, or CNC as it was known among inmates and staff, was designed to house offenders of varying backgrounds, from career criminals to those serving shorter terms for less violent crimes. It was not the most brutal of California's institutions, not like Folsom or San Quentin, but it was large, impersonal, and crowded. Men like Bittaker, who prided himself on his intelligence and calm demeanor, could navigate its halls without attracting too much attention. He was, by this time, an older inmate, nearly 40 years old, quiet, and self-contained. He kept to himself, often reading or tinkering, and though he could be manipulative when needed, he was not someone who picked fights. Norris, on the other hand, was younger, in his late 20s, and carried with him the volatility that had defined his earlier offenses. Where Bittaker was cold, Norris was restless. Where Bittaker analyzed, Norris erupted. Yet in prison, their differences would not divide them. Instead, they would begin to complement one another. Their first encounters were not dramatic. They were not cellmates thrown together by chance, nor were they immediately inseparable companions. Instead, they met gradually, introduced through the casual interactions of prison life, time in the yard, shared meals, conversations in common areas. At first, it may have seemed like any other prison acquaintance, two men with long records exchanging stories and grievances about the system that had confined them. But beneath the surface of those conversations, something darker began to form. Each man recognized in the other not just a criminal history, but a particular hunger, a shared fascination with domination and control. It was Bittaker who likely took the lead in those early conversations. He had the patience, the intelligence, and the manipulative skill to probe. He listened to Norris, drawing him out, encouraging him to speak about his fantasies and desires. Norris, whose past was filled with violent sexual crimes, did not hold back. He spoke of women, of power, of the urges that had driven him again and again into assault. For most men, such conversations would have been alarming, even within the walls of a prison. But for Bittaker, they were intriguing. He had long carried fantasies of his own, darker than most ever dared to share. To hear another man describe similar impulses was not a warning sign, it was an invitation. Soon, their conversations moved beyond the casual. They began to meet more frequently, talking in hushed tones, sharing details of crimes, and slowly allowing their fantasies to intertwine. Bittaker's nature was to plan, to structure, to test the boundaries of possibility. Norris's nature was to feel, to erupt, to imagine the act itself without restraint. Together, they began sketching out ideas that most inmates would dismiss as empty bravado. But for them, these were not idle boasts. These were plans, sharpened each time they returned to the topic, each time they exchanged another layer of detail. What drew them together was not friendship in the ordinary sense. Neither man was capable of true loyalty or affection. Instead, theirs was a partnership forged out of mutual recognition. Each saw in the other the possibility of fulfilling fantasies that, alone, might have remained just that, fantasies. Norris lacked the patience and cunning to create opportunities without being caught. Bittaker lacked the impulsive drive to push himself beyond the limits of thought into action. But together, they filled each other's voids. Where Norris imagined the thrill of abduction, Bittaker envisioned the logistics, how to select a victim, how to transport her, how to avoid detection. Where Bittaker considered the use of tools and planning, Norris urged escalation, feeding the fire of cruelty with his compulsions. Their discussions became disturbingly specific. They fantasized about acquiring a vehicle that would allow them to abduct victims quickly and efficiently. They talked about the tools they might use, not sophisticated weapons, but everyday instruments that could be repurposed into devices of pain and control. Screwdrivers, pliers, hammers, items that could be explained away if discovered, yet carried devastating potential in the hands of men determined to use them for torture. They even began to categorize roles for themselves. Bittaker would be the planner, the one who decided when and where. Norris would be the aggressor, the one who overpowered and restrained. Their fantasies were rehearsals, and each conversation acted as another step toward transforming imagination into reality. The prison environment, ironically, gave them the time and space to build this twisted alliance. Days stretched long and monotonous, leaving hours to talk, to fantasize, and to build trust in one another's darkness. Other inmates might have brushed off such conversations as posturing, but Bittaker and Norris returned to them again and again. With each session, their fantasies grew more elaborate, their plans more concrete. They were not speaking in vague hypotheticals, they were outlining futures. The casual cruelty of prison talk had hardened into an agreement. When they were released, they would act on what they had discussed. By 1978, the outlines of their pact were clear. They would find a vehicle, preferably a van, that could serve as both transportation and prison cell. They would select their victims carefully, focusing on young girls who hitchhiked or walked alone on California's wide, lonely streets. They would abduct, restrain, and torture, taking their time before killing. And they would document their crimes, preserving evidence for themselves as trophies, proof of their dominance and control. This was not the talk of two men passing time behind bars. This was the blueprint for what would become one of the most sadistic crime sprees in American history. When Bittaker was paroled in 1978, followed by Norris in early 1979, they carried that blueprint with them. They reunited on the outside, no longer confined by prison walls, free to act on what they had only whispered about in the past. The white GMC van that Bittaker acquired later that year would become the physical manifestation of their fantasies, the rolling chamber of horrors that would earn them their notorious nickname. But none of it would have been possible without those first conversations at the California men's colony, without the recognition of one predator by another, and the decision to walk the path together. In the sterile, impersonal environment of prison, two men had found the missing halves of their own monstrosities. The child abandoned and cold met the child abused and raging. The planner met the impulsive. The manipulator met the aggressor. And in that union, their darkness was no longer confined to fantasy. It was waiting patient and hungry, ready to be unleashed the moment they stepped beyond the gates. Their meeting was not fate, but it was catastrophic. The California men's colony had not intended to create monsters when it placed Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris in proximity. But by failing to recognize the depth of their shared sickness, by treating them as just two more names in a crowded system, it allowed them the time to form a bond that would leave a trail of devastation. When monsters meet, the world outside rarely realizes the danger until it is too late. When Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris walked out of prison, they did not step into freedom the way most men do, with relief, hope, or plans for a new beginning. They stepped out carrying an unspoken agreement, a pact forged in whispered conversations behind walls of concrete and steel. For them, release was not a second chance. It was the opening of a door they had been waiting to walk through. Outside those prison gates, the fantasies they had rehearsed could finally be acted upon. What had been theory in the California men's colony was about to become reality on the streets of Los Angeles. Bittaker was the first to secure his freedom. In 1978, he left prison with the same cold composure he had always carried. Older now, in his late 30s, he knew how to blend into society when necessary. He was not the type of criminal who attracted immediate suspicion. To neighbors, he appeared quiet, even ordinary. He picked up work in a local machinist shop, earning a reputation for being punctual and technically skilled. For someone of his intelligence, the work was beneath him, but that never seemed to bother Bittaker. He did not seek prestige, he sought cover. A steady job, a small rented apartment, a predictable routine, these were not signs of reform but camouflage. He lived quietly, waiting for Norris to join him, knowing that together they would put their prison-born pact into motion. Roy Norris was paroled in early 1979, and upon release, He gravitated back toward the familiar streets of Southern California. Norris, unlike Bittaker, did not have the same calm exterior. He was restless, drifting between odd jobs and temporary arrangements, but he quickly reconnected with his older prison acquaintance. Where Bittaker was detached, Norris was excitable. Where Bittaker spoke in measured tones, Norris spilled with nervous energy. Yet when the two reunited, the dynamic that had been forged inside prison walls quickly reasserted itself. Norris was eager, almost desperate to prove himself, and Bittaker, the manipulator, was ready to provide structure to their shared fantasy. The first step in their plan was mobility. They had spoken in prison of the need for a vehicle, not just any car, but something large, unremarkable, and practical for their purposes. Bittaker, ever the planner, was the one to act. In early 1979, he purchased a silver 1977 GMC cargo van. On the surface, it looked like any other work vehicle, the kind of van used by handyman contractors or delivery drivers. It was the perfect disguise. There were no windows along the sides, only in the front and back, ensuring that once someone was inside, the world outside would never see. For Bittaker and Norris, this was not just transportation. It was a mobile prison, a rolling chamber where their fantasies could unfold away from prying eyes. They gave it a chilling nickname that only they would use, the Murder Mobile. The van became their sanctuary. Its blank metal walls and sliding side door made it ideal for abductions. Victims could be pulled inside quickly, hidden from view and restrained. But to transform the van from an ordinary vehicle into the stage of their crimes, they needed more than steel walls. They needed tools. The same tools that had filled their fantasies in prison conversations now began to appear one by one in the back of the van. The collection started innocuously. Screwdrivers, pliers, and hammers, the kinds of items any workman might carry. But for Bittaker and Norris, these were not tools of trade. They were instruments of control and torture. Each addition to the toolbox carried a different possibility. Pliers could pinch, tear, or inflict pain without leaving fatal wounds. A hammer could be used to threaten or to kill. Screwdrivers could stab, puncture, or intimidate. They did not purchase exotic weapons or elaborate devices. Instead, they relied on the ordinariness of their instruments. The horror of the toolbox was not in its uniqueness, but in its familiarity. Bittaker, with his machinist skills, made adjustments to some of the tools, sharpening edges, reinforcing handles, ensuring that they would not break under strain. He kept everything organized, neat, methodical, as though preparing for a job that required precision. Norris, meanwhile, provided the enthusiasm. He marveled at their growing arsenal, imagining how each piece might be used. He fed on the anticipation, unable to conceal the excitement that had brewed in him since prison. The van and the toolbox were not just practical. They became symbols of the partnership itself. The van was Bittaker's domain, acquired with his money, chosen with his strategic mind. The toolbox reflected Norris's influence, filled with the promise of violence, each instrument a manifestation of his compulsions. Together, they embodied the union of planning and impulse, of cold calculation and raw brutality. Before they began their campaign of abductions, they tested their vehicle and methods. They drove along California highways, scouting locations, watching young women who hitchhiked or walked alone. In the 1970s, hitchhiking was still common, particularly in Southern California. Teenagers and college students, trusting the openness of the era, often accepted rides from strangers. For Bittaker and Norris, this cultural habit was an opportunity. They picked up girls at first without harming them, rehearsing the approach. Bittaker would drive, smooth talking with comma 40, while Norris sat in the passenger seat, sizing up their passenger, ready to act if necessary. These trial runs served purposes. They refined their method and reassured their victims that the men in the van seemed harmless. During these tests, they built confidence. They confirmed how quickly someone could be pulled inside, how the van's sliding door created both speed and concealment, and how easily their voices could be masked in the ordinary chatter of offering a ride. Each practice run was not about kindness or indecision. It was about sharpening the blade of their plan. They knew the moment would come when the rehearsals would end and reality would begin. By mid-1979, the van was fully equipped. Inside, beyond the toolbox, they stocked duct tape, ropes, and other restraints. They prepared for every possibility: gagging, binding, silencing. Bittaker's meticulous nature ensured that no detail was overlooked. He even tested how quickly the side door could be opened, how fast a body could be pushed inside, and how much sound could escape when the door slammed shut. Norris contributed by feeding ideas about how to inflict pain, how to keep victims alive long enough for their cruelty to escalate. The synergy between them grew more seamless with each passing week. Their lives outside the van continued with deceptive normalcy. Bittaker worked at his machinist job, gaining a reputation as a reliable employee. To his co-workers, he was just another man trying to make ends meet. Norris drifted more, never quite settling, but his instability drew no great suspicion. They blended into their surroundings, masking the monstrous reality that traveled with them in the form of a plain silver GMC van. The contrast between their outward appearances and their secret preparations was stark. By day, they were ordinary men moving through ordinary routines. By night, they prowled highways, testing, planning, refining. The van rolled quietly through the sun-drenched streets of Los Angeles, a predator cloaked in metal. The toolbox sat waiting, its contents gleaming with menace in the dim light. And all the while the fantasies that had been whispered in prison grew louder, closer, ready to be made flesh. It is chilling to reflect on how unremarkable the van must have looked to passers-by. To most, it was invisible, another work vehicle, another piece of the city's machinery. But inside, it carried the seeds of nightmares. Every hammer, every screwdriver, every pair of pliers was not just a tool but a promise. A promise that the men inside would not simply kill, but torture, prolong, and revel in the suffering of those unlucky enough to cross their path. The van and the toolbox were not the beginning of their violence. Both men had long histories of crime and cruelty. But together, these objects became the vessel and the altar of their partnership. They gave form to what had once been only fantasy. They transformed idle talk into tangible preparation. And in the quiet streets of late 1970s California, no one could have guessed that a plane then rolling by might carry within it the architects of one of the most sadistic sprees of violence the state would ever endure. When Bittaker and Norris finally began their spree, the van would become infamous, its sliding door etched into memory as a portal of terror. The toolbox would become synonymous with cruelty, each instrument a reminder of how ordinary objects can be twisted into instruments of horror. But before the spree began, before the first victim was pulled inside, there was only anticipation. Anticipation and preparation. Two men waiting in the shadows of their own creation, ready to turn the road itself into a hunting ground. When Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris finally set their plan in motion, the transformation from fantasy to reality was abrupt, cold, and horrifying. For months they had rehearsed, driven their van through the neighborhoods and highways of California, tested their ability to lure young women inside, and refined their method of approach. By late spring of 1979, their preparation had sharpened into confidence. The van was stocked, the toolbox was ready, and their partnership had hardened into a pact of cruelty. Now, what had once been whispered in prison began to take form on California's sunlit roads. The first victim whose fate intertwined with the Toolbox Killers was a young girl named Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, known as Cindy to her friends and family. She was just 16 years old, walking home after leaving a church event in Redondo Beach on June 24, 1979. Cindy was described by those who knew her as kind and devout, someone whose quiet faith and gentle demeanor made her beloved among her peers. On that evening, as she made her way along the street, she was entirely unaware that a silver GMC van was circling nearby, two men inside watching her every step. Bittaker was behind the wheel, his eyes sharp, his demeanor calm as always. Norris sat beside him, restless, excited, urging that this was their moment. They had passed Cindy twice already, testing the timing, gauging her reaction to their presence. On the third approach, Norris leaned out and offered her a ride. She declined politely, not wanting to enter a stranger's van. But for Bittaker and Norris, the refusal did not end their pursuit. It was only an obstacle to overcome. They circled again, this time stopping with a calculated maneuver. Norris stepped out, seizing Cindy and forcing her inside the van. In seconds, the sliding door shut, sealing her fate. What followed was a ritual of cruelty that would repeat itself with each victim. Cindy was bound and gagged, stripped of her autonomy, and driven away from the safety of her home. Bittaker and Norris took her into the San Gabriel Mountains, a remote location they had scouted in advance. There, hidden from the eyes of the world, they assaulted her. The ordeal lasted for hours, with both men taking turns inflicting pain and degradation. Cindy's faith, her youth, her innocence, none of it mattered to the men who saw her only as an object for their fantasies. By the time the night was over, Cindy was dead, strangled with a wire coat hanger tightened with pliers. Her body was discarded in a canyon, left to the elements. For Bittaker and Norris, the first kill was not a source of remorse but exhilaration. They had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. 2 weeks later, they struck again. Their second victim was Andrea Joy Hall, a 15-year-old girl hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway on July 8, 1979. Hitchhiking had been a lifeline for many young people of the era, a way to travel cheaply and quickly, but for Andrea, it became a trap. Bittaker and Norris pulled alongside her, offering a ride. At first, she accepted a lift from another vehicle traveling in the same direction, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though fate might spare her. But Bittaker and Norris were persistent. They followed, shadowing her, waiting for another opportunity. When Andrea exited the first vehicle, they pulled up once more. This time, they succeeded in drawing her into the van. Inside, Andrea was subjected to the same ordeal as Cindy. She was gagged, bound, and taken into the mountains. The details of her suffering are harrowing. She was forced to endure hours of assault and torment, her cries silenced by the isolation of the wilderness. Bittaker, meticulous as always, insisted on photographing parts of the ordeal, capturing trophies to relive later. These images, horrifying in their content, revealed not only the violence inflicted but the cold detachment of the men who orchestrated it. Andrea, like Cindy, was eventually strangled. Her life ended with the same cruel method. Her body, too, was discarded in a canyon, hidden from the world until long after her killers were caught. By now, Bittaker and Norris were emboldened. Their success in capturing and killing 2 young girls without detection convinced them of their own invincibility. The van became their hunting ground, rolling quietly through neighborhoods, beaches, and highways, blending into the ordinary while carrying extraordinary horror within. The toolbox grew more stained, its instruments more frequently used. And the men grew bolder, less cautious, as though the thrill of each crime fed a hunger that could never be satisfied. Their third known victim was Jackie Gilliam, 15, abducted on September 3, 1979, along with her friend Jacqueline Lamp, 13 years old. The two girls were waiting near a bus stop in Hermosa Beach when the van approached. Bittaker and Norris offered them marijuana, an easy lure for two curious teenagers. The girls accepted, stepping into the van, unaware of the trap closing around them. What followed was perhaps the most prolonged and brutal ordeal of all. Bittaker drove them into the mountains once again, while Norris kept them restrained. Over the course of nearly 2 days, both girls were repeatedly assaulted and tortured. The man used the tools from their box with sadistic creativity, inflicting pain not just for control but for pleasure. At times, Bittaker recorded their suffering on audio tape, preserving the sounds of their terror as though it were entertainment. The cruelty extended beyond the physical. The girls were taunted, degraded, forced to confront their helplessness in ways that stripped them of dignity, even as they fought to survive. In the end, both girls were murdered. Jackie was stabbed in the chest with an ice pick before being strangled, her body thrown down a ravine. Jacqueline was also strangled, her remains discarded nearby. Their youth, their trust, their ordinary plans for that day, all were consumed by the violence of two men who saw them only as prey. For investigators who later uncovered the details, the audio recordings were among the most haunting pieces of evidence. Proof not only of the crimes, but of the sheer cruelty with which they were committed. The spree continued. Their fourth victim was Shirley Ledford, 16 years old, abducted on Halloween night, October 31, 1979. Shirley was hitchhiking home from a party in Sunland to Geneva, trusting, as so many had, that the ride she accepted would be safe. But when Bittaker and Norris pulled up, she entered the van and stepped into the last hours of her life. Shirley's ordeal was the most brutal of all, and unlike the others, her murder left behind a recording so horrifying that it would later become a key piece of evidence at trial. Inside the van, Shirley was subjected to unimaginable torture. The men used pliers to twist and tear, inflicted beatings, and taunted her as she cried for mercy. The recording captured her screams, her pleas, and the sadistic delight of her attackers. For nearly 2 hours, they prolonged her suffering, documenting every moment. Finally, they strangled her with a wire hanger, ending her life as they had ended the others. But unlike before, they left her body on a suburban lawn, discarded openly for someone to find. This was not carelessness. It was arrogance. It was their statement to the world that they could do as they pleased without fear of capture. Shirley's murder marked the peak of their spree. It was the culmination of the fantasies that had begun in prison, the full realization of the horrors they had planned. From Cindy to Shirley, each victim represented not just a life lost, but a life destroyed in the most dehumanizing way imaginable. Young girls, filled with promise and innocence, were reduced to trophies for two men whose only bond was their shared appetite for cruelty. Looking back, the timeline of their victims reveals both the escalation of their violence and the chilling efficiency of their methods. From June to October 1979, in the span of just 5 months, they abducted, tortured, and killed at least 5 teenage girls, each crime more brazen than the last. The van rolled through the streets like a predator, in plain sight, the toolbox clinking with the instruments of torment. And California's highways became hunting grounds where innocence could be stolen in an instant. The victims' names, Cindy Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Jacqueline Lamp, Shirley Ledford, remain etched in the record of their crimes. Reminders that behind the monstrous headlines were real lives, real families, and real grief. They were daughters, sisters, friends, each robbed of a future. Their stories are not just footnotes to the narrative of two killers. They are the heart of it. Without them, there is no story of the Toolbox Killers. It is their lives, stolen and extinguished, that reveal the true horror of what Bittaker and Norris unleashed. When two predators come together, united by shared fantasies and driven by matching appetites, it can feel, at least for a time, like their bond is unbreakable. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris believed that. Their prison-born partnership had carried them into the real world, where the whispered plans became blood-soaked realities. Yet, as with so many alliances forged in darkness, cracks soon began to appear. Trust between them was never rooted in loyalty or friendship. It was rooted in utility. Each man needed the other. Bittaker needed Norris's impulsive violence, and Norris needed Bittaker's calm precision. But once the killings mounted, once the toolbox clinked with the echoes of their crimes, the weight of what they had done began to press differently on each of them. The cracks in their pact did not emerge all at once. They widened slowly like fault lines beneath the earth, until finally the ground gave way. At first, their dynamic remained steady. They congratulated themselves on how smoothly their plan had unfolded, how easily the van could move unseen through the neighborhoods of California, how quickly they had dispatched 5 young girls without attracting suspicion. They spoke of their crimes not as horrors, but as accomplishments, trophies of their dominance. Yet beneath the surface, Roy Norris was changing. His impulsiveness, the very trait that had fueled their spree, also left him vulnerable. The adrenaline high that followed each abduction faded quickly for him, leaving in its place a gnawing restlessness. He wanted to talk, to relive the details, to boast in ways that Bittaker found dangerous. Bittaker, ever the cold strategist, recognized the risk. He was meticulous in keeping their crimes hidden. He collected photographs, tapes, and trophies, but he stored them carefully, ensuring they were concealed from outsiders. He drove the van with precision, cleaned it when necessary, and avoided drawing attention to himself. Norris lacked that discipline. He grew sloppy in conversation, dropping hints to acquaintances, making crude remarks about women, and even alluding to violence. For Bittaker, this looseness was unacceptable. To him, the crimes were not just about the thrill, they were about control. Control of the victims, control of the situation, control of the secret. Norris's inability to keep quiet threatened all of it. One of the earliest and most dangerous slips came when Norris confided in an old friend named Joseph Jackson. He told Jackson about the murders, about the van, about what he and Bittaker had done together. At first, Jackson did not take him seriously. The idea was too horrific, too grotesque to believe. But Norris's insistence and the details he provided planted a seed of doubt. If even part of what Norris said was true, then it meant that young girls were being abducted and murdered in Los Angeles by 2 men driving an ordinary van. That seed would eventually grow into the lead investigators needed. Meanwhile, Bittaker sensed that Norris was becoming a liability. The bond that had once seemed like destiny now revealed its fragility. Bittaker had never trusted Norris completely. Trust was not in his nature, but he had relied on him. Now, he began to see him as reckless. Still, he did not sever ties. Their partnership had been too effective, and Bittaker believed that he could keep Norris under control. He underestimated, however, the power of fear that had begun to creep into Norris's mind. Norris was hunted in ways Bittaker was not. While Bittaker viewed their crimes with clinical detachment, as though they were experiments carried out in pursuit of knowledge, Norris was more visceral. He relished the violence, yes, but afterward, he was left with images he could not erase. The screams of the girls, the sight of their lifeless bodies, the feel of their resistance as he held them down, these things lingered. At times, they thrilled him, at other times, they unsettled him. And when the unsettling moments came, they chipped away at his resolve. Unlike Bittaker, who was capable of compartmentalizing everything, Norris carried his crimes with him, unable to silence the echoes. the paranoia setting gradually. He worried about being caught, about someone recognizing the van, about one of their trial-run passengers remembering their faces. He worried about the photographs and tapes that Bittaker kept, evidence that could be used against them if discovered. He even worried about Bittaker himself, fearing that his older partner might one day turn on him. For Norris, the pact that had once given him power now felt like a trap. He had bound himself to a man who frightened him as much as he excited him, and he began to look for ways to unburden himself. The final fracture came after the murder of Shirley Ledford on Halloween night, 1979. Her torture, captured in its full horror on tape, left an indelible mark. Bittaker regarded the recording as a prize, listening to it repeatedly, reliving the control and domination it represented. Norris, on the other hand, was shaken. The sheer brutality of Shirley's suffering was overwhelming, even to him. Though he had participated fully, afterward he could not shake the feeling that they had gone too far, that the walls were closing in. For the first time, the fantasy no longer felt sustainable. In November of that year, Norris finally confided in Joseph Jackson once more, this time with greater urgency. He told Jackson in graphic detail about the murders, the van, the toolbox, the girls. Jackson, horrified, contacted his attorney, who in turn alerted the police. The tip quickly found its way to investigators in the Los Angeles area, and though it sounded unbelievable, they could not ignore it. The description of the van, the mention of specific victims, and Norris's own criminal history gave the story weight. As investigators began piecing together the information, they placed both Bittaker and Norris under surveillance. They noted the van, the movements of its driver, the connections to missing girls. Slowly, the net began to tighten. Norris, realizing that the walls were closing in, faced a choice: remain silent and risk going down with Bittaker, or save himself by cooperating. His fear tipped the balance. When confronted by police, Norris cracked. He confessed, spilling the details of their crimes in exchange for a plea deal. The cracks in the pact had finally torn it apart. Bittaker had relied on Norris to be his accomplice, his instrument of violence, but Norris's instability proved their undoing. The very impulsiveness that had driven their spree now destroyed their secrecy. In the end, it was not police ingenuity or investigative brilliance that first broke the case open. It was the fragility of their partnership, the inability of two monsters to hold their pact together under the weight of their own cruelty. Bittaker was enraged when he learned of Norris's betrayal. In his mind, their crimes had been controlled, their risks minimized, their secrets safe. He could not comprehend why Norris, who had participated fully and often with enthusiasm, would turn against him. But Bittaker's cold logic overlooked what made Norris dangerous in the first place: his volatility. For a man like Norris, loyalty was never permanent. Fear, guilt, and self-preservation would always outweigh any oath. When the cracks widened into a collapse, the entire story of the Toolbox Killers began to unravel. Norris's testimony, combined with the physical evidence recovered from Bittaker's van and home, painted a picture too horrifying to ignore. The tapes, the photographs, the tools, all of it confirmed the nightmare. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. For the investigators, they were a grim validation of the tip they had nearly dismissed as unbelievable. The cracks in the pact revealed a final truth: evil partnerships rarely endure. They are built not on loyalty, not on trust, but on shared hunger. And hunger, once fed, always grows restless. For Bittaker and Norris, the very qualities that had made them so effective as predators ensured that they would ultimately destroy one another. Their reign of terror, brief as it was, collapsed under its own weight, undone not by external forces alone but by the weakness within their bond. When Roy Norris finally cracked and began talking, It marked the beginning of the end for the Toolbox Killers. For months, Lawrence Bittaker and Norris had prowled the highways of Southern California in their unremarkable silver GMC van, leaving behind a trail of vanished teenage girls. Families grieved in confusion, communities whispered in fear, but the connection between the disappearances remained hidden. Had Norris kept silent, their spree might have lasted longer, perhaps even continuing indefinitely. But his need to unburden himself, to share the unbearable weight of what they had done, became the loose thread investigators needed to pull. And once that thread began unraveling, it exposed the full horror of the crimes. The first to hear Norris's confessions was Joseph Jackson, an acquaintance from the world outside of prison. Norris, jittery and restless, had already spoken loosely about his crimes before, but this time he described them in chilling detail. He told Jackson about the van, about the toolbox filled with ordinary implements turned into weapons of torture, about the young girls who had been dragged inside and subjected to unthinkable cruelty. He described the nights in the mountains, the recordings, the photographs, the pliers, the ice pick. At first, Jackson wanted to dismiss it as a grotesque boast, the sort of sick exaggeration one might hear from a man eager to shock. But Norris's insistence, his specificity, and the haunted look in his eyes made it impossible to ignore. Jackson took the story to his attorney, and from there, it quickly reached law enforcement. Detectives in Los Angeles County were skeptical. The story sounded too extreme, too sadistic to be real. Two men driving around in a van, abducting teenage girls, torturing them with tools, recording their screams on tape. It bordered on the unbelievable. Yet the list of missing girls matched the ages and descriptions Norris provided. The details of where the bodies had been discarded aligned with areas known for unexplained disappearances. The silver GMC van fit reports from witnesses who had seen young women enter such a vehicle before vanishing. What began as a far-fetched tip suddenly took on the weight of plausibility. Investigators decided to act. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, working with Torrance Police, placed both Norris and Bittaker under surveillance. Officers observed the van, noted Bittaker's movements, and quietly gathered background information on both men. Bittaker, outwardly calm and composed, lived in a modest apartment, still employed as a machinist, his co-workers describing him as punctual and polite. He did not appear to fit the profile of a sadistic killer. Norris, however, was more erratic. His prior convictions for sexual assault, his volatility, and now his damning confessions drew the sharper scrutiny. The more detectives listened, the more the picture became clear. These were not idle boasts. These were admissions of genuine crimes. On November 20th, 1979, Roy Norris was arrested on a parole violation, providing investigators the opportunity to question him directly. Faced with the possibility of a lengthy return to prison and terrified of shouldering the full weight of responsibility, Norris agreed to cooperate. What poured out in the interrogation rooms over the following days was a confession so detailed and so disturbing that even seasoned detectives struggled to process it. Norris described the abductions one by one, naming the victims: Cindy Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Jacqueline Lamp, Shirley Ledford. He recalled how they had been lured into the van, bound, gagged, assaulted, and tortured. He told of the San Gabriel Mountains, where the men drove with their captives to isolated fire roads and canyons. He described the toolbox, the pliers, the screwdriver, the hammer, and how each item had been used. The detectives listened as Norris spoke of hours of torment, of screams echoing in the van, of laughter and taunts from Bittaker as the girls begged for mercy. He admitted to strangling victims, to hearing the sound of their last breaths, to disposing of their bodies in ravines. He even recounted the recordings Bittaker insisted on making, particularly of Shirley Ledford, whose torture had been preserved on tape. The more Norris revealed, the more horrified the investigators became. This was not just another homicide case. This was sadism elevated to a ritual. With Norris's cooperation, police secured a warrant to search Bittaker's apartment. What they found confirmed every word. Inside, they uncovered Polaroid photographs of young girls, some alive, others dead, captured in various stages of torment. The images revealed not only the identities of victims, but also the casual cruelty with which the crimes had been committed. More damning still was the discovery of audio tapes. On one, the chilling sounds of Shirley Ledford's final hours played out in real time, her screams, her pleas, the voices of her tormentors mocking and instructing. Detectives who listened to the tape were shaken, some brought to tears, others unable to continue. It was the kind of evidence that could never be unheard, proof not just of murder but of a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. The van itself became another piece of damning evidence. When investigators examined it, they found traces consistent with Norris's descriptions. The metal floor bore marks of struggle. Fibers and hair suggested the presence of multiple victims. The toolbox, though partly emptied, still contained instruments that matched the accounts of torture. Every detail Norris had given was substantiated, transforming his confession from the ramblings of a paranoid criminal into an undeniable record of truth. Lawrence Bittaker was arrested shortly after the search of his apartment. Unlike Norris, he remained cold and unyielding under questioning. He denied everything, dismissing the accusations as fabrications born from Norris's desperation to save himself. Where Norris crumbled, Bittaker was steadfast, his demeanor calm, even smug. He spoke as though he believed himself untouchable, as though his careful planning and lack of direct physical evidence tying him to the murders would protect him. But the photographs, the tapes, and Norris's testimony painted a picture too detailed to ignore. Bittaker could deny, but the evidence spoke louder than his words. For investigators, the confessions and evidence created a dilemma. Much of the physical proof, the tapes, the photographs, the van directly implicated both men. But only Norris was willing to testify. To secure a conviction against Bittaker, they needed Norris's cooperation. In exchange for his testimony, prosecutors offered him a deal, life imprisonment, sparing him the death penalty. For the families of the victims, this was a bitter pill, knowing that one of the monsters who had destroyed their daughters' lives would escape execution. But prosecutors argued that without Norris's testimony, Bittaker might walk free. Justice, imperfect as it was, required compromise. As news of the arrests broke, the public reacted with shock and horror. The details leaked to the press painted a picture of depravity that seemed almost impossible to believe. Ordinary tools, a common van, to men who looked like any others, and yet behind those ordinary facades lurked a cruelty that defied imagination. Parents grew more fearful, young women more cautious, and communities that had once seen hitchhiking as harmless now viewed it as a risk not worth taking. The Toolbox Killers had not only destroyed lives, they had shattered a sense of safety that would never fully return. In the months that followed, detectives and prosecutors pieced together the full scope of the case. Norris continued to provide details, revisiting crime scenes with investigators, pointing out locations where bodies had been discarded. Some remains were recovered, though others were never found, lost to the ravines and wilderness where they had been thrown. Each recovery brought renewed grief to families, confirming what they had long feared but could not prove. Forensic analysis matched items found in Bittaker's possession to the victims, further strengthening the case. The confessions and evidence left little doubt about the guilt of both men, but the trials that lay ahead would test the endurance of all involved. Prosecutors prepared to play the tapes in court, knowing that their content would horrify jurors, but also prove essential in securing convictions. Families braced themselves for the agony of hearing their daughters' final screams, preserved forever on tape. Detectives, many of whom had been hardened by years of confronting violence, admitted that the Toolbox Killers case was unlike any other, not only for its brutality, but for its casual, calculated cruelty. By the end of 1979, the walls had closed in completely. Bittaker, once confident in his cunning, now sat behind bars, awaiting the trial that would expose him fully to the world. Norris, having betrayed the pact he once swore, faced a life behind prison walls, spared execution only because he had chosen to talk. The van was impounded, the toolbox catalog, the photographs, and tapes locked away in evidence rooms. The story that had begun as a whispered fantasy in the California men's colony had reached its climax. Two men, once partners in cruelty, now divided by betrayal. Their atrocities laid bare for all to see. The arrest and confessions revealed not just the crimes themselves but the fragile nature of the bond between Bittaker and Norris. Together, they had unleashed horror. Alone, they collapsed under pressure. One clung to silence, the other to survival, but in the end, both were caught in the same net, exposed by the very crimes they had believed would never be discovered. When Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were finally separated and placed in custody, the pact that had once bound them dissolved completely. What had begun as whispers in a prison yard had transformed into a spree of unimaginable cruelty, and now it would all be dragged into the harsh light of the courtroom. Trials are always spectacles in their own way, but few in California's history carried the same macabre weight as that of the Toolbox Killers. It was not only the crimes themselves that shocked the public, but the evidence, the photographs, the testimonies, the tapes that revealed in excruciating detail what two men had done to girls barely in their teens. Roy Norris, for his part, had already sealed his fate by cooperating with prosecutors. His decision to betray Bittaker was born less of guilt than of fear of execution, fear of carrying the full burden alone. By agreeing to testify, he ensured that he would avoid the death penalty, instead serving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For many, this felt like a hollow justice. Norris had participated in every abduction, had laughed as the toolbox clinked open, had wielded pliers and rope with sadistic enthusiasm. Yet he would live, his heart still beating, while his victims lay in unmarked graves or forgotten canyons. Still, the prosecution insisted that Norris's cooperation was essential. Without him, Bittaker might have walked free, shielded by his cold silence and the lack of direct witnesses. The trial of Lawrence Bittaker began in 1981 in Los Angeles. From the outset, it was clear this would not be an ordinary proceeding. The charges against him included 5 counts of first-degree murder, as well as multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and criminal conspiracy. But it was not the charges alone that made the trial notorious, it was the evidence the prosecution intended to present. Among the exhibits were the Polaroid photographs of the girls, showing them in moments of captivity and terror. More devastating still was the existence of the audio recording made during the torture of Shirley Ledford. The decision to play the tape in court was not taken lightly. Prosecutors argued that it was the most damning piece of evidence, proof that could not be dismissed as fabrication. Defense attorneys fought to exclude it, knowing that once jurors heard the sounds of Shirley's final hours, there could be no question of their client's guilt. In the end, the judge ruled it admissible. What followed became one of the most haunting moments in the history of American criminal trials. When the tape was played, the courtroom filled with the sound of Shirley Ledford's voice, her screams, her desperate pleas, her cries for mercy. Overlaid were the calm, mocking tones of Lawrence Bittaker and the cruel laughter of Roy Norris. Jurors shifted in their seats, some covering their faces, others wiping away tears. Court reporters wept openly. Even hardened investigators, who had heard the tape before, found it unbearable in that setting. the suffering of a teenage girl echoing off the walls of justice. The defense attorneys, pale and shaken, could do little to counter what was now burned into the memory of everyone present. Outside the courtroom, the case captured public imagination in a way both horrifying and compulsive. Newspapers carried lurid headlines, radio stations debated whether the tape should have been played, and parents across California warned their children never to hitchhike, never to trust a stranger. The myth of safety in suburban streets and sunlit highways had been permanently shattered. The van, once an invisible part of the American landscape, became a symbol of lurking terror. Bittaker sat through the trial with a demeanor that unnerved many. He showed little emotion, often appearing detached, even when confronted with the photographs or when forced to hear the tape of Shirley's murder. He denied nothing outright but insisted that Norris had exaggerated, that his partner's testimony was unreliable. To the jury, his calmness did not read as innocence, it read as coldness. It reinforced the image of him as the calculating architect, the man who turned ordinary tools into instruments of torture and an ordinary van into a chamber of horrors. The testimony of Roy Norris proved decisive. On the witness stand, he recounted their crimes in detail, naming each girl, describing the methods, explaining how the toolbox had been used. His words painted a picture that aligned with the photographs and recordings, leaving no room for doubt. Though despised for his role, Norris became the key to convicting Bittaker. Without him, the case might have crumbled into ambiguity. With him, it became undeniable. In March 1981, the jury returned its verdict. Lawrence Bittaker was found guilty on all charges. The penalty phase was swift. The prosecution pushed for death, arguing that if any man deserved execution, it was Bittaker. The jurors agreed. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain on death row for decades. He never expressed remorse, never admitted guilt, never apologized to the families of the victims. To the end, he insisted that the stories were exaggerated, that Norris was the true monster. But the evidence, the tape, and the verdict told another story. Roy Norris, meanwhile, began serving his life sentence in a different California prison. Though spared execution, he lived in the shadow of infamy, known by inmates and guards alike as one of the Toolbox Killers. He granted occasional interviews, sometimes expressing regret, other times retreating into evasions. His life behind bars was long, monotonous, and defined by the crimes he could never escape. He died in prison in 2020, after decades of incarceration. Bittaker, too, never left prison alive. He died in 2019, still on death row, having outlived his own sentencing by nearly 4 decades. The legacy of the Toolbox Killers is a chilling one, marked not only by the deaths of their victims, but by the cultural imprint they left behind. Their crimes forced communities to confront the vulnerability of their youth, the dangers of trust, and the thin line between ordinary objects and instruments of horror. The van became infamous, its sliding door a symbol of abduction. The toolbox, once filled with tools of work, became synonymous with cruelty. And the tape of Shirley Ledford's murder entered the annals of criminal history as one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence ever presented in court. For the families of the victims, the trial brought a kind of closure, but never peace. The photographs and recordings ensured that their daughters' final moments were preserved not in memory but in evidence, replayed in courtrooms, and described in headlines. Their grief was compounded by the public nature of the trial, by the way their private loss became a national spectacle. Yet they endured, testifying when asked, sitting in court as the tape played, holding each other up in the face of unimaginable cruelty. In the years that followed, the Toolbox Killers became a case study in both criminology and media. Scholars examined their partnership, seeking to understand how two men, each damaged in different ways, could combine to create a spree of violence neither might have committed alone. Journalists revisited the case in articles and documentaries, each time returning to the same haunting details: the van, the toolbox, the tape. For true crime enthusiasts, the case became a grim touchstone, an example of the darkest depths of human behavior. But beyond the studies and stories, the legacy of Bittaker and Norris rests most heavily in the way their crimes altered the sense of safety in California. Hitchhiking, once a common practice, declined rapidly in the wake of their spree. Parents warned children never to accept rides, schools issued bulletins about stranger danger, and the image of the anonymous van cruising the streets became embedded in the cultural imagination. The crimes of the Toolbox Killers contributed to a broader shift in how America viewed personal safety, particularly for young women. In the end, the trial, the sentences, and the long years of incarceration did not erase the horror of what was done. Justice, imperfect and incomplete, ensured that neither man would ever walk free again. Yet justice could not return Cindy Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Jacqueline Lamp, or Shirley Ledford to their families. It could not undo the suffering captured on tape, nor erase the scars left on the community. What it did was send a message that even the most cunning and brutal killers could be caught, exposed, and punished. But the shadow of their crimes remained, a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how ordinary tools can become instruments of terror, and how two men in an ordinary van turned California's highways into hunting grounds. The saga of the Toolbox Killers does not end with sensational headlines or even with the gavel strike in a crowded courtroom. It lingers instead in the quiet spaces left behind by absence, in the wounds carried by families who never saw their daughters come home, in the uneasy silence that settles over communities once terrorized by two men in an unremarkable silver van. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris are dead now, but the memory of what they did remains, as sharp and enduring as the tools they once wielded. Their story is both a closed chapter and an open wound, a reminder that some crimes echo far beyond the lifetimes of those who committed them. Bittaker spent his last decades on San Quentin's death row, a prisoner of the state, but also, in his own way, still a prisoner of his pride. He never expressed remorse, never offered a genuine apology. Instead, he played the role of a cold strategist, insisting that Norris had exaggerated, that the stories had been blown out of proportion by prosecutors and the press. Yet when the photographs and tapes existed, his denials rang hollow. He outlived his death sentence, dying in 2019 of natural causes. Some saw it as unfair that he evaded the punishment jurors had deemed just. Others saw his decades in a tiny cell as its own form of torment. Whatever the interpretation, his death closed the book on a man whose name had long been synonymous with cruelty. Roy Norris, spared the death penalty by his cooperation with prosecutors, lived out his years in prison as well. His fate was quieter but no less grim. He admitted his role in the crimes during trial, testifying against his former partner, and in exchange secured life without parole. To many, it felt like a betrayal not only of Bittaker but of justice itself, one killer pointing the finger at the other to save his own life. Norris died in 2020 behind bars, his body succumbing to illness after decades of incarceration. His death, like Bittaker's, brought little sense of closure. For the families, their daughters were still gone, their screams still captured forever on tape, their faces still frozen in the Polaroids recovered from a dingy apartment. The legacy of the Toolbox Killers lies not in the men themselves, but in the irreversible consequences of their actions. The 5 victims, Cindy Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Jacqueline Lamp, and Shirley Ledford, remain at the heart of the story. Each had dreams, futures, and families who loved them. They were not defined by the suffering they endured, though the court system, and the media often reduced them to case files and exhibits. They were daughters, students, friends. Their absence left holes that could never be filled, gaps in family photographs, empty chairs at dinner tables. Their memory endures not because of the men who ended their lives, but because those who loved them refused to let them be forgotten. For investigators and jurors, the Toolbox Killers case left scars of a different kind. Detectives who listened to the tapes of Shirley Ledford torture described them as the most haunting moments of their careers, sounds that would follow them long after they left the evidence room. Jurors, forced to hear the recording in court, carried with them the knowledge of a girl's last moments in agony, etched into their memories by the cruel insistence of the prosecution that such evidence was necessary for justice. Even reporters, hardened by years of covering crime, found themselves shaken by the details. The legacy was not just death, it was trauma, second-hand but enduring, inflicted on everyone who came near the case. The wider impact of the crime stretched beyond families and courtrooms. In Southern California, hitchhiking, once a common and relatively accepted practice, plummeted in the years following the killings. Parents spoke more sternly to their children about stranger danger. Schools issued warnings. The cultural image of a plain white van shifted almost overnight from a symbol of practicality to one of lurking menace. Urban legends flourished, some exaggerated, some rooted in the awful truth that two men had once roamed the highways with nothing but a van and toolbox, and their appetite for suffering. Criminologists and psychologists continue to study the Toolbox Killers, seeking to understand what made them who they were. Some point to childhood trauma, Bittaker's abandonment, Norris's abuse. Others argue that trauma alone cannot explain the depths of sadism both men exhibited. Many criminals suffer hardship without becoming predators. What set Bittaker and Norris apart was not just their histories, but the way they fed off one another once they met. Alone, each might have remained a dangerous but limited offender. Together, they created a storm. Their partnership magnified their cruelty, their fantasies reinforcing and escalating until they moved from imagination to action. It is this dynamic to broken men finding affirmation in each other's darkness that makes their case a chilling study in what criminologists call dyadic violence. Over time, their story slipped from headlines into the darker corners of true crime lore. Documentaries, books, and podcasts revisit the case, recounting the details with morbid fascination. Each retelling brings back the same question: why? Why did they do it? Why those victims? Why with such cruelty? The answers vary, but none fully satisfy. Some crimes resist explanation, existing not as logical outcomes, but as reminders of the capacity for evil that lies dormant in humanity. For many, the only solace is that their reign was short, cut off before more lives could be lost. And yet, even short reigns leave long shadows. Families live for decades with the consequences, their grief renewed by each anniversary, each mention of the case in media. The sound of rain on a roof, the sight of a van on a quiet road, the mention of a daughter's name, all can bring back memories too painful to bear. For these families, there is no epilogue, no neat conclusion. Justice was delivered in the only form it could be, but it did not restore what was taken. The Toolbox Killers remind us of a truth too uncomfortable to ignore: evil often looks ordinary. Bittaker was a machinist, punctual and polite at work. Norris was just another man trying to blend into life after parole. They did not wear masks or stalk alleys with dramatic flair. They cruised highways under the California sun, offering rides, making small talk, projecting normalcy. Their tools were not exotic weapons, but hammers, pliers, and screwdrivers, things found in any garage. This ordinariness is perhaps the most frightening aspect of their story. They were not monsters in appearance. They were men indistinguishable from countless others, until it was too late, In the end, the Toolbox Killers story serves as both a warning and a memorial. A warning that danger sometimes hides in the everyday, that vigilance is necessary even in places that seem safe, and a memorial to the young women whose lives ended too soon, whose voices, though silenced, are not forgotten. Each retelling, each documentary, each whispered warning to a new generation carries with it their names, their stories, their humanity. For Bittaker and Norris, there is no legacy worth honoring. Their names survive only as cautionary tales, examples of depravity that scholars and storytellers revisit not out of admiration but out of necessity. They are remembered not for who they were, but for what they did, a difference that strips them of the identity they once clung to and leaves them only as symbols of cruelty. As the years pass, the details blur for those not directly touched by the crimes. The dates fade, the locations shift into obscurity. But for the families, for the investigators, for those who heard the tapes or saw the photographs, the memories remain sharp. The case may be closed, the killer's dead, but the horror persists, carried forward in quiet ways, shaping lives in ways unseen by the broader world. That is the true epilogue, not the death of the killers, not the end of the trial, but the continuation of pain and remembrance in those who must live with the aftermath. The Toolbox Killers are gone, but their story will always remain, not because they deserve to be remembered, but because their victims do.